Talking of Britain being as we always do, because it is, we've known for quite some time, have we not, that Britain has been in a state of moral, economic, spiritual collapse. And to a degree, infrastructural, of course. But we didn't realise it was quite this bad. Britain's school children are not just in danger from members of the British royal family.
This special school near Southend was meant to be reopening its doors after the summer break. But now the only people allowed in are building surveyors. Parents were told yesterday that the school was one of the 104 that had been identified as containing potentially dangerous aerated concrete, known as RAC, so would remain shut to students for at least a week.
Yeah, so RAC, it's basically a cheap house version of concrete, right?
Yeah.
Which was used in buildings just after the war because we were dirt poor and needed to get lots of buildings made. Understandable.
Yes.
Safe for a short period of time. These are meant to be temporary buildings that, because of neoliberalism being baked into the British economy now, means that we don't really build new infrastructure, and we certainly don't replace old infrastructure that does exist. We just pretend like it's not crumbling. Now, when it says that they've identified 104 schools, do you know how they did this and how incompetent a process this is?
No.
They sent out a questionnaire to all of the schools. They received some back.
Oh.
And of the ones they received back, they identified these 100 and whatever schools that are in danger, but that still leaves 40% who didn't even respond. This building material was used in lots of places like hospitals, housing blocks, etc., which are also going to start collapsing.
The thing is that there was never something inherently wrong about using a material that needs to be updated ever so often. You know that it's got a 30-year life, you put it into all of your notes that you've got that 30-year lifespan, and then once a lifespan nears its end, you start your refurbishments, you remake your buildings, whatever it might be. Now, I think it's better to just have properly built buildings that last forever, but if you're strapped for cash, maybe you can't afford to do that straight away. The issue comes is when you elect a government who is outsourcing everything to the private sector through PFIs, and in 2010 you elect a government who's not spending any money at all, public or private. So all of those renovations that you were supposed to be doing, all of that continual maintenance of these really important public buildings just never got done.
Yeah, that's what I mean about neoliberalism being so baked into the system now that this is not going to change fundamentally, which means it's going to get worse. Yeah, I've got no problem with the post-war governments doing it on the cheap, because they sort of had to, really.
Yeah.
It wasn't really an option. It's the fact that we decided to, rather than invest the money that was made in the post-war boom, making permanent infrastructure, or at least semi-permanent infrastructure, nothing's forever, of course, to replace this sort of stuff, we just invested it in tax cuts for rich people and allowing boomers to pretend like that could go on forever. The ghost of Margaret Thatcher looms ever larger over the British political system.
And because of PFIs, even if we did elect a government that wanted to fix this stuff, which we don't, because they don't want to spend any more money on schools because they've said they're going to stick to Tory spending plans. All of these places are so mired in PFI debt that we're spending all of this money trying to maintain these debt repayments instead of the money that we could be spending or doing the refurbishments necessary, because it's going to cost so much money to re-upgrade this infrastructure so that it's, you know, not in the state of collapse. And I couldn't think of a more apt summation of neoliberal Britain than this entire saga.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the neoliberal coming home to roost.
The rapid halt to the new term at over 100 schools in England comes after a number of incidents, including a beam collapsing in a school over the summer that showed no prior signs of damage.
Yeah, that's normal. And they said that the first one of these collapses happened in 2018, which A, shows how long we've been endangering kids, and B, that the Tories are lying when they say this is a new problem, because since then it's been asked about in Parliament over 100 times.
This really should bury the Tories at this point. It really should. But they won't be buried by anything, because the Labour Party are running on the same spending plans.
The only thing getting buried is children in rubble.
Ayo.
But this isn't the first time this has happened. In 2018, a school staff room with RAC collapsed one weekend with little warning. And we've spoken with a headmaster at St Andrew's Primary School near Bolton, who said part of his school collapsed because of RAC in 2017.
Jesus Christ. Isn't the government's first job to protect people?
But you'll find, unfortunately, Kev, that they're not the people they're meant to protect are multiple homeowners in sunny rural constituencies from
True.
having social housing built anywhere near them, lest ruffians move in next door. Those are the real people that get protected, and or oligarchs with lots and lots of money.
Are you saying they don't care so much about poor kids from Bolton?
Yeah, I'm maybe insinuating that poor children from working class northern towns are indeed not particularly high on the list of government's priorities for protection. I mean, to be fair, at least we can get Mike Graham to grow concrete for these new schools.
That's true, from his concrete tree.
He's a prolific cultivator of concrete trees.
He is.
6 years later, and just a month before the most recent collapse in a school, the Department for Education published their annual report. In it, they say at the time of publication, there are no open schools or college buildings where we know of an imminent risk of harm.
Yeah, that worked out well.
Well, to be fair, that is true where we know. If you don't look, then you'll never know. So they're not lied.
True. Okay, you know what? I apologise. Yeah, I didn't take into account your ridiculous sleight of hand there, Department of Education. You are technically correct. Honestly, this could end up being one of the massive stories of this generation, really. The amount of money that should have been being spent over the last 40 years on this infrastructure is going to have to be spent in the next 10 years, which is going to be a massive strain on public finances.
So a big problem now faces the government. But were there earlier opportunities to get on top of it? We know that RAC has been on the government's radar since at least 2002, when the Building Research Establishment...
What? People continue to tell me, right? Oh, no, actually, no, the Blair government was super progressive. It was just kind of a new kind of spin on social democracy. Sorry, mate, just right-wing garbage that led to just the kind of problems that we have here. They were told 8 years before their term ended, and they did all about it.
Yes.
That was the UK government's Building Safety Lab, raised concerns following tests. Skip forward to July 2018, and those concerns got very real indeed when the roof of a classroom in Kent collapsed.
Well, who'd have thought if you get warned about something and then 16 years later you've done nothing about it, things might go wrong.
No, but have you considered that the government doing things is communism?
That is true.
Fortunately, there were no pupils there at the time. In December 2018, the Department for Education said they made building owners aware of recent component failures. Then, in 2020, a safety alert was issued by an independent building safety reporting service. They learned of two more...
Treebor PD in chat makes a really good point, that it is worth pointing out that there were plans from Gordon Brown. So it took Gordon Brown becoming Prime Minister for this to happen. There was plans for refurbishing schools that Brown had in the 2010 manifesto. David Cameron came in and said that's government spending and therefore it's communism, so we can't do that.
Incidents involving RAC, including an even earlier classroom collapse at a...
So, in 2020, so that's 3 years ago, presumably the last 3 years the government have been working feverishly to try and sort this problem out, because it's clearly a massive issue, right?
But it wasn't until March 2022 that the Department for Education sent out a survey to councils in England asking them to find out which schools contained RAC. That's 4 years after the collapse in Kent.
They sent out a questionnaire, a voluntary questionnaire to school districts. I can't think of a single way to improve that system.
Today, the Schools Minister, Nick Gibb, admitted that even now, not all schools have responded. In July this year...
And make them! What are you doing? Tell them, ring the up now and
send round inspectors.
Give me the information I request, otherwise I'm going to come round and bring the trebuchet with me. To be fair, you've made this meme 255, but it's basically true. I think that would be a solution to a lot of government problems. Having actual consequences for pricks in positions of authority might actually start getting some done.
The Department for Education did send us this statement in the last hour that the decision to close or partially close schools was made out of an abundance of caution, they say, and that more than 90% of schools have now responded to their RAC survey.
That still means 10% of schools, and thus roughly 10% of children, are at complete danger. We have no fucking idea. We might as well send them to school with a random bomb that's going to explode in one of the classes.
There are 32,000 schools in the UK. 32, that's 3,000 schools that might have potentially dangerous architecture. 3,000!
Yeah, I mean, it's just madness. This is insane.
Why it took 4 years to send out that survey following the collapse of a classroom ceiling in Kent. They pointed out that they, in collaboration with the local government association, released a warning shortly after that incident, encouraging schools to report issues with rack.
Well, Warren Thomas is a concrete expert. And you've actually been checking schools,
I have actually
even in the
today.
last couple of days.
Even today, yes.
But you've not found any that are...
Luckily, I haven't
down.
found anything so far in London.
Now,
so.
you've brought some of this rack concrete in with you. Could you explain what's wrong with it?
Well, the variation from what we would call conventional reinforced concrete, rack concrete, as you can see, has no aggregate, so it's a lot weaker. The main concern is we have a hidden defect here. Here you can see quite clearly
Like the
where a
Antiques
reinforcing
Roadshow.
bar was adjacent to this area. This can corrode with no outward signs. You'd normally get a crack in conventional concrete, would give us an idea of what's going on. Here, you don't get anything.
So you'd never tell?
So you never tell. What you have to do, you'd have to undertake non-destructive testing, which we could determine this. But that's the second stage. The first stage is what I believe has happened in the schools so far, is they've identified rack concrete. But they then need to go on and determine the condition of the rack concrete before you close or open the schools. And I don't know if that's what they've done. The government hasn't really given out any information.
How long have you known that rack concrete was a problem like this?
I believe
public buildings?
first publications where there could be concerns was in '96. But following the collapse of the school in Kent in 2018, the CROSS department, which is the Collaborative Reporting of Safer Structures, produced a guidance note, and very shortly after that, the Institute of Structural Engineers. So 2019, we knew there were problems. And because of that collapse, we should have been checking straight away from then what was going on with the schools and other structures that may have rack concrete in there as well.
How can we blame this on small boats? That's what they're doing in Downing Street now. Like, come on, there's got to be a way we can link migrants to structural engineering problems. Look, it's woke to not have brick walls fall on your children. Fact.
I don't know if the government has kept information to themselves and made a decision, because I can't see why.
That's it. Dodgy Polish builders. You nailed it, Rohak. You nailed it. There you go. Just blame it on the Poles. Be fine.
The lack of information that's coming from, have they actually ascertained the condition of all the schools that have rack concrete in there? First question, I don't know. You can safely manage rack given the right expertise and experience. You don't have to.
So had it been done gradually, there wouldn't have been any need to suddenly close
I think
scores of schools.
I think we're trying to catch up, because...
Again, you've got 40 years of spending that should have been happening that hasn't. And we're going to find out to our cost how much that was.
I was listening to some other news, and I believe 15,000 schools were built between the 30s and the 90s. I don't believe 50% of them have been tested.
And what other kinds
Jesus
of buildings
Christ.
could be using this stuff? Is it any kind of building? I mean, could it be in this building? I mean,
It's mainly buildings that would have been built by the government. So anything like the old PSA.
why? Because it was cheap? Or
Well, no, not necessarily. It was just after the war, it was quite a cheap product to use, lightweight, so it could be built very easily. So it was predominantly schools, hospitals, courts, police stations, job centres.
Okay, let's not check the police stations. Let's look. If we're going to do priority, I'm just saying police stations don't have to be atop of that list. Plus, they're never in them anyway. They're out fighting crime on the streets, aren't they?
No, actually, no. According to Mr. Reform UK guy, 90% of them are just sitting in their offices looking at tweets.
True. They're in danger then. Oh, well.
And other government organisations.
housing?
I haven't seen it in housing. I've seen it in a residential house in Wales.
What do you mean by that?
It was a house that had been built. It was a large house that had been converted into multiple occupancy. And when they came, someone bought it to do it up, big house. And this is where these samples come from. And he had no idea what was going on. And we got called in after being on one of the news shows.
So this is much bigger than schools, basically.
It could be in a number of other buildings, and we don't have a robust investigation or maintenance of buildings. We do on bridges and other assets in the country, buildings. The Grenfell Tower is a classic example. We don't really look at.
So we're just fucked. Everything's fucked. Schools are fucked. Hospitals are fucked. Every single thing is just fucked.
I'm so glad that I basically spend all of my time at home and never leave, because my home was built in the 30s, so I know I'm fine.
Is mine fine? I don't even know.
How many potential structural defects do we think are in like all the tower blocks around the country that were then, sold off to like housing associations that weren't even like originally state owned in the first place?
And literally they weren't supposed to still be here. Again, it's another example of a short-term solution, which was very good for the time. We needed lots and lots of housing for lots and lots of people, cheaply and quickly erected erected, so the tower blocks worked. They were supposed to be gone within 30 years. We are now 60 years, 70 years.
Yeah. 'Cause I'm not going to blame the people in the construction industry for getting things done at the cost and remit they were given by the state. And the problem is that short-term buildings are fine as long as you have the plans and the desire to actually do the replacements and the refurbishments and the maintenance.
Well, I think
30 years down the line when you're planned to do so.
Well, I think the governments in the post-war consensus just thought, well, there won't be governments in the future that don't give a fuck about the people or the country in any way whatsoever.
Yeah.
And you know what? That was a relatively sensible, if erroneous, thought on their behalf. Because just like the government did come along and has consistently been there ever since.
Well, earlier I spoke to the shadow
According to
education
Phil,
secretary.
you sound very anti-British, Kevin. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Proudly so.
Guilty as charged, sir. The reason I'm so frustrated is that it can be so much better. There's a lot of money here. There's a lot of industry here. There's a lot of potential human creativity here. And if we were actually to unleash that by having a government and systems in place that would allow for that flourishing, we could be a fucking amazing place.
Well, we need the government to be absolutely clear about the extent of the schools that are affected by this. We haven't seen a full list published of all of the schools affected. I think ministers should come clean and parents have got a right to know. But then there's been the suggestion today from the schools minister, Nick Gibb, that actually there might be more schools. So we can't even be completely confident that we understand the full extent of the challenge that we're seeing at the moment, and keeping children safe in school has to be the #1 priority.
This is not a new thing. I mean, we first covered it months ago in February, and it goes back years. Do you understand why the apparent panic just before the start of term?
This has been a known issue for years, and in the time that I've been Shadow Education Secretary, I've been raising this time and time again with ministers.
For once, I'm going to give a Labour frontbencher the benefit of the doubt, because I think some crazy amount of times it's been asked about in the House of Commons and just never been gotten round to. And she, to be fair, I think she's part of the 2010 intake, so it's not like she's ever had a chance to influence policy on this direct. As I was saying before, she can come out here and say, well, government should be doing this, government should be doing that, all of these things, etc., etc. What school's going to be affected? And I'm like, okay, right, this problem's not going to be solved in the next 18 months or 12 months, however it is, until we come towards the next election. By the time there's going to be an election, this is going to be still going to be a huge problem, because we're not going to have time to retrofit every single potentially structurally unsound building in the country between now and then. So you're going to have a plan of what you're going to do to deal with it. And you've already told us that you have no extra money to spend and you have no intention on raising taxes, because you also don't have any more plans to spend any money. All of the money from the private school VAT fees that she's promised us, one of her flagship policies as Shadow Education Secretary, is taxing private schools and using that to fund free breakfast schools for kids and a teacher dividend for continual service, whatever, to keep them in the job. That's all of the money. They're going to have to cost everything penny for penny, regardless of what it is, even if it could be theoretically paid for by fiscal expansion, which, to be fair, I don't think this could be. And they're going to come in and say, well, actually, no, unfortunately, there's no money left. According to Lucy Powell, the credit card has been maxed out.
These last 13 years have meant that we've ended up in a position where lots of our schools are just not fit for purpose.
Well, whose fault is it within the government?
Well, I think you do have to question Nick Gibb on that. Nick Gibb was the schools minister in 2010 when the incoming Conservative government took the decision to cancel the Building Schools for the Future programme, Labour's school rebuilding programme. They completely failed to put in place any national plan for what came.
Because they had, after 12 years, after 12 years in government, they had a plan for rebuilding schools, even though it was 8 years before then that they were first told about this potentially structural unsound issue. But every single interview that they can now go, well, we had this plan for schools that was scrapped by David Cameron, which is of course true. I'm not going to let David Cameron and George Osborne get away with this, because if anyone is to blame, of course, yet again, we always come back to the same man every single time. It's always George Osborne. He's always to blame for everything, because it's literally true, he is. That no one will then scrutinise and say, well, look, you had 8 years. Why did it take you that long to even look at this stuff?
Here we are today, Nick Gibb on the television talking about major problems across our schools estate. The chickens are coming home to roost after 13 years of Conservative negligence where it comes to our children's education.
Right, but the government's going to have to pay.
And lives,
And lives. Yeah. You've got to be putting things in the obvious perspective. If you want your children not to get crushed by falling beams, don't vote Tory.
All the building work that needs to be done in these, what could be hundreds of schools, then there's going to be all sorts of other public sector buildings that might also need to be rebuilt. This could turn into a massive bill, and you want to be the Education Secretary next year, and you don't have a long-term plan either, because you're worried about committing money.
Well, I don't know the full extent of what we're facing.
Finally,
I don't think
someone did it. Someone said the Labour Party have no plan because they refuse to spend any money. The only good journalist in the country apparently is Krishnan Gurumurthy.
Even know the full extent of the challenge around crumbly concrete, let alone the wider challenges that we're facing in the schools estate. So I'd want to take stock of exactly what's going on. I would want to understand the full extent of the challenge that we face. But as we did in 1997, we will once again put Britain on a better path. We will put education right at the heart of the vision that we want for our country.
These are great words, but where's the substance? And, you know, that's why people do say about
my
you know,
guy.
this basic dilemma of what's the point of voting Labour if you're not prepared to actually say how things will be different? It's not good enough to just say we'll be more competent.
Well, I think it will be a good starting point, but no, I accept that. And that's why, you know, I've said that we'll end the tax breaks that private schools enjoy, and we put that money into thousands more teachers in our classrooms. I'll make sure that
How
we
much
have
concrete are you going to,
every...
how many retrofittings are you going to do, Bridget? There's no point putting more teachers in schools if the school collapses. All you're doing is killing more teachers.
Let's take a lesson from the movie 300 and just build walls out of dead teachers. It makes sense.
Every primary school child in England. I'll drive up standards across our country. I'll reform Ofsted. I'll deliver more apprenticeships. I'll make sure that young people, whatever their background, have
That's
every
not the question.
opportunity.
The question was about concrete.
Yeah.
This is pathetic. We have no opposition. Nothing.
No, yeah, basically. Well, the SNP, but they want to leave.
Yeah, literally.
Bridget Phillipson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, as we've said, the problem of rat concrete goes wider than school buildings. It features across the NHS estate as well. So earlier, I spoke to Sir Julian Hartley, who's the chief executive of NHS providers. And I began by asking him about the current situation with NHS hospitals.
Reinforced aerated concrete has been used in hospitals, and obviously there's an estate's risk around reinforced concrete. We know that it's got a lifespan of around 30 years, but some trusts have used these materials for over 50 years. So in terms of the scale of this across the NHS, there are 7 hospitals that are at the most critical risk, and all of those are in the new hospitals programme and obviously due for replacement by 2030. We'd like to see that move more quickly.
Apparently.
Technically, yeah.
Technically a new buzzer.
Thanks, buzzer.
But in the meantime, money has been spent to mitigate the risk by using things like steel struts and scaffolding to ensure it
Scaffolding. We've become a scaffold hole, man. The only reason hospitals aren't collapsing is because of scaffolding.
And when you think countries in like the Eastern Bloc, they were using concrete to build whole tower blocks out of panels, and even those had more structural integrity than our schools and hospitals that were
They're
built in
still
the
standing,
prosperous capitalist West.
Yeah, they've still got those fucking commie blocks. They're still
They
there.
do.
The ones in Chernobyl that have had no upkeep for decades are still there.
Yeah, literally.
They don't need scaffolding. We're a country that's less structurally sound than fucking Chernobyl. Neoliberalism has been more destructive than the meltdown of Reactor 2 at Chernobyl.
There was like a quote from that Mick Wright said at the year's debate with Matt Goodwin. It's like the Soviet Union, but inexpensive.
Yeah, a little bit. There's a certain truth to that, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Things are literally just crumbling. The whole country's falling apart.
Yeah. And again, I just have to reiterate to the person who said it earlier, I do hate Britain. Yeah. I hate what it's become. It was never great, but it's now utterly
If you enjoyed this video, please do consider liking and subscribing. It does help out the channel and the algorithm. And if you click the bell notification icon, it will let you know when I go live and when I upload videos. If you'd like to follow me on social media, my handle is @NoJusticeMTG, and that is Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, and YouTube. If you want to support my channel in a more financial manner, you can do so by becoming a member for just 99p, by super chatting, or by supporting me on Patreon, with the link is in the description of this video, and hopefully I'll catch you on the next segment.